All right, let's keep working on this Jonsered 625. So before I start slapping, got all the parts in, and before I start slapping the cylinder back together, I want to actually get the handle on the crankcase so I can manipulate the saw a little bit better. Whether or not I'm going to put it in a vise or keep it on a bench. All right, so you might recall that the fuel vent right here is leaking like a sieve. Okay, these are definitely very hard and bad fuel line. So that and the fuel filter will need to be replaced. So we'll go over that in this video, and we will reinstall the AV buffer mounts, the anti-vibe mounts. They're actually in pristine shape, so I do have spares, but we're just gonna reuse the old ones. All right, so be right back at you. Let me get some gloves on. So let's work on the fuel line here first. Just leave that in there so we don't have to deal with the fuel quite so much right now. I'm going to grab some pressing fluid. First I'm going to pull this up a little bit. Then I'm going to put just a little bit of that pressing fluid there. Soak up the excess. I'm just going to see how that'll pull through nicely there. I'm going to dry it up. Keep pulling that through a little bit. So now there's no pressing fluid that's going to go back down. And we're just going to cut that off. And pull it back through. Use a hemostat for that. Clamp down on it and then pull it right through like that. Okay, I'm going to release it. I'm going to take this old filter off. I want to keep the fuel line to the extent possible so that I can measure a sufficient amount out. All right, we got you at a slightly different angle here. So This is really, look at that. I just cracked it right there. It was pretty stiff and brittle, so it's really a good thing that we're replacing this. Seems okay on the portion that was inside the tank, but the stuff outside had really dried out. Now the length was a pretty good length. And let's see here. We will pop that like so. And boy, yep, won't need to. It was a pretty good length. So we're not going to toy with that length at all. We're just going to leave it there because we can trim off the end above after the fact. So it looks like what we need through the tank, this is basically where it was sitting in the tank right here. So what we need below the tank is right about there. So I'm just going to mark that with a marker right now. Just going to mark it right here, and then I'm marking the tip here. So I marked the tip for the fuel filter. I'm using a blue marker so it stands out a little bit. And then I've got the mark right here, which is where it should come through the housing on the oil tank. All right, so let's go back to that a little bit later. What I want to do now, so that I don't run the risk of wrecking the new fuel line, is I want to deal with the fuel vent that's leaking. And the way the service manual says you're supposed to deal with this is just break it off. Break the stem off and then press it out. But I don't see why we can't just press the whole thing out. I'm going to first try a slotted screwdriver because the fuel vent right here does have a slot in it, so I'm just going to use that. I don't know if it'll come out at all, but at least I can, you know, maybe loosen it some. Maybe it'll decide to come out on its own. It does have ridges, you know, that kind of fit in there tightly. Doesn't really seem like it's coming out, but I have loosened it. So now we're going to see if we can use the hemostat here to grab the stem on the inside. And see if we can't press it out, and we did. And that prevents me from having to actually break it, which the service manual says, and run the risk of not being able to fish it out or have some plastic parts in there. So there it is. And it doesn't look like it was actually leaking around the housing here. It was leaking through the center of the center of it. So let's just set that aside. clean this up a little bit. Be back at you in a second. All right, we're back. So you notice that there was a little bit of, buildup here. I can't really tell if that was actually sealant or something else. So I'm just going to grab a Q-tip here with some alcohol maybe and see if I can get in there and clean that and determine whether in fact there's some gunk in there and whether in fact there's the need to maybe clean that out with something and or reuse or reapply some sealant to this portion of the stem. Wider here, and then it tapers down here in that housing. You won't be able to see it. I was able to clean stuff there. I do not think there was any sealant. So we're going to go without any sealant. If we determine that this new vent is actually leaking, so you see there's some fuel in there and some alcohol, so I'm just going to run a clean Q-tip to make sure that things are dry up around here. There is a tiny little bit of fuel in the tank. Eventually I'm going to probably want to get rid of some of that because it's got some debris in it, although that's what your fuel filter is for. Okay, so let's get the a new replacement fuel vent. I got a spare here. Here is the part number, just so that you know. These are OEM parts, which I believe in, much more so than aftermarket. Okay, so we're going to grab one of those, and this is something that's supposed to just get pressed home. There's nothing more to it than that, than pressing it to get it, fully seated in there. I'm going to try and do a little more cleaning in there. All right, we're going to see how that works. So the first thing I'm going to do is just press it in by hand here. Once I get it pressed into that extent, it's always good to have some of these drifts available. It's a little big. This one will be just about right. I'm just going to use that to help me send this home. So I'm just gives me a little more leverage. And it doesn't go in more than or when it's fully seated, it's going to be only about maybe 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters in there. Okay. So one of the things I might try now, pop the fuel cap back on. Kind of an interesting fun fact. When they started making these Jonsereds, they were already owned by, or at least the 625, they were already owned by Electrolux, basically Husqvarna. Notice how this was actually an orange handle for a Husqvarna, and then they used dye to make it red. This particular part is basically equivalent to the Husqvarna 268s that were also being built at the time. So I'm going to go ahead and block that off or seal it. I love these flippy caps, and I'm really glad I'm able to use that on this old saw. And then I'm gonna plug the end here, and so we do have some fuel in here, and I'm gonna plug off the fuel line. Okay, now you notice I have fuel here. That's because I put my finger, lifted my finger. But there isn't anything coming from the fuel vent actually. So at least there's not going to be, we really won't know how it performs until I either do a pressure test or get it fueled up. And we might do a pressure test on this just to make sure that the vent is venting the way it's supposed to and not spewing out too much fuel, but holding it and releasing it as it's supposed to. So let's just go ahead and proceed getting the fuel line in place now. So for this, what I'm going to do is, so remember, I got a blue tip there, and here's where I want to bring that just below, or right, basically right at that interface there. That'll give me sufficient length to be able to grab and service and replace the fuel filter, and it gives me the length I need to daylight up into the crankcase, and I'll have a little extra actually that I can trim off later for connecting to the carburetor. And this is where that pressing fluid comes in pretty handy. Because it's going to eventually dry just fine on its own. It doesn't leave any residue behind. So overnight I might leave the fuel vent or fuel cap open, and so that this can evaporate, so I don't run the risk of any contaminant or reaction with the gas residue that's in there. And so this should be it's going to fit in there a little bit tight because it's brand new rubber, and may need to use a pawl or something like that to help get it started. So let me see if I can show you this from this side here. And so I've got a little bit of I'm going to make sure my pressing fluid is all the way down there. I'm going to now try and press this in, but just get it started using this pawl. There we go. Once I get that started, because of the pressing fluid that's on there, I should be able to, you can't probably tell, but I am able to pull that down in there. I'm able to push it in there pretty effectively. Then I'm going to open my cap, grab my handy hemostat again here, and we'll need a little bit of light so I can see the end of that hose. And I'm going to crank down on the hemostat, and I attached it right to the end where the fuel filter is going to come in. That way I'm not risking damaging that elsewhere in the fuel line and running a risk of perforating it and creating a leak. So I'm just pushing it and pulling it because I don't want to put too much pressure on it. I'm keeping track of where that mark that I put on the fuel line is. And so I'm just going to keep sending that home until I get that mark, which is right at the tip of my fingers now. And at this point, I'm actually going to kind of grab the fuel line back there with my finger, and I've got it now right where I need it. We're done. And now I can go ahead and grab myself a brand new fuel filter. Let's go ahead and get that fitted as well. And you may you're gonna, especially these new hoses, are gonna take a little bit of pressure. You wanna get that all the way on there. All right, now we're gonna pop it in there. And go ahead and seal our cap. All right, now if I really wanna test the vent, I can probably do it right now. We'll plug the end here using the pawl. Be careful so I don't do that too much and risk perforating it, but I'm just gonna lay it over like that, and so I don't puncture it. Make sure everything is dry around here, and you know, nothing's spewing. And I'm just gonna bring some fuel all the way to the, what little bit is in there, I'm gonna bring it all the way up to the top. Nothing's coming out around the fuel line. We got a pretty good seal on the vent. So other than the pressure aspect of fuel potentially coming through there, we got that successfully installed. Let's continue on now. Well, now I'm noticing after I did that, well, I pulled on the fuel line. You may have seen that. I pulled on the fuel line, and so a little bit of fuel did actually bypass up here. But that should be a good, and now it's coming out the end. So yeah, we're okay. We're okay. All right, so at least as far as we know, we're okay with the fuel. Okay, now let's refit our AV mounts. Okay, so I'm going to start. There's 4 small ones, 2 on either side here on the handle, and then there's 2 larger ones up here. So first I'm just going to start these by hand. Just initially get them started. It's plastic. These are self-tapping threads on these. So you won't be able to get them started very far before they start gripping. And because I don't know which ones were installed where, they're the same size, but there may have been, because it's old rubber, there may be a little bit of misalignment. So it might take a little bit when I fix this to the crankcase, just to make sure that, take a little extra care to make sure that everything is lined up so that I don't risk stripping bolts or the threads on these AV mounts. All right, so I've just got them hand finger tightened here. Okay. And then instead of using the specialty tool that Husqvarna makes for these, I just have articulating jaw needle nose that I think I showed you when I dismantled this saw. So right here you got notches, and those are a convenient place to put those, to put an articulating jaw, pair of pliers, and then I'm just gonna hold those firmly and twist the mount until I have it home and come up with too much resistance to there. So now I'm just twisting the rubber, doing no good, so I know I've got it fully seated. I'll just do the same to all of these. So you know when you get it finally tight. Okay, second one's in. See, we're getting some fuel coming down from the hose here. And it's coming from the end of the hose. And maybe to prevent that a little bit, I'm just going to loosen the, it's not coming from the vent, fortunately. So to prevent that, I'm going to just loosen the fuel cap a little bit. All right, see if we can prevent that from happening again while we're working here. Okay, that one's in place. Okay, the 4 small ones are in place. Now we're gonna work on the large ones, and they have a little bit bigger notch. It'll be easier for me to use a tool like this, since the pliers fit right into the notch a little better. Okay. Yep, we don't have any more fuel coming out the end of that fuel line because we've eased the pressure off the fuel cap. All right, everything is tightened home on that. All right, so we should be golden, but there's one more thing we can do, and that's going to be probably do a pressure test to make sure that we got the tank sealed the way we want to. I'll be right back at you in a little bit. All right, I actually could not find any information on what the proper pressure relief is to do the proper pressure test on this. So at any rate, we're done with the tank assembly. So let's get the tank onto the crankcase. And let me zoom you out a little bit. So I've installed this grommet here, which the carburetor is going to sit on. Got a bellows here, and that's going to fit here. We're going to get that done first. The throttle cable will move through that. Our fuel line is going to come through here. Incidentally, if interested, there's the part number for the bellows. The old one was technically still good, but it's starting to dry out and get brittle. It's cheap. So this, you might be able to see, has a little bit of a slot on it. Let me get you zoomed in a little bit more. See that slot? And you can see the slot over. The slot will be oriented like that, so I want to try and keep that in orientation so I don't have to fool with it during install too much. And so there it is. The nice thing about the new rubber is that it's going to sit really well and hug that contour nicely. The old one was not doing that, and so that was leaving the possibility of having some entry point for debris. All right, so I've been covering my cylinder as much as possible. Incidentally, I'm just going to show you. Listen to this. There's no noise, and look how silky smooth this is. So I went ahead and cleaned the crank with brake fluid, and then oiled her up, and it's just immaculate. Okay. So the first part of this process You will notice I don't have anything protecting the bearing on this side right now, but I do have the crank install tool there protecting the bearing on the clutch side. Just a good idea to keep debris out as much as possible. So all I'm doing is lifting the crankcase to fit those two front AV buffers in the proper location. And then, I'm gonna have to, a little premature there. Now that's fitting in, and before you drop everything, now's the time to fit up your fuel line. And then really the trickiest part initially here is to make sure that you get your bellows installed. And I'm actually gonna just take it out and fit it over this shaft and install the bellows from down below, because the knob here on the throttle is not going to be the easiest to get in there. So we're just going to invert it like that to insert it, get it over there. And then as we bring this down up and through the bellows port here, we can just let it slide back and let the whole bellows ride up like that. And then I'm just going to use a finger to press those AV mounts where they're supposed to go here. Okay, now I can go back to my bellows and just press that home over the throttle shaft. And it's not so tight where you're going to need pressing fluid or anything like that. All right, so now I'm going to take my hemostat, because it has a blunt end, and I am just going to push that bellows here down a little bit. I want to make sure everything is fitting nicely on the contour of the crankshaft here. Again, so that as it hardens over time, it doesn't maybe create a bypass situation for debris. I'll pull up a little bit here on it. Just you may need to fool around with it a little bit to see how you can get this to fit, but I think we got her pretty good there. Okay, I'm gonna pop this back in place there. Now, you see there's a big hole here, and that's okay, it was there before. But there was this little cut piece of rubber, and you can easily find the right diameter, and it was split here. I don't think it was actually the OEM part for this. So the saw must have been serviced at least once, replaced the fuel line, and this kind of replaces the function of a grommet. And it was just there to help plug that hole to minimize, again, some possibility that debris is going to come in from underneath the saw there. All right, so we basically have the handle positioned in place, but we need to get the bolts put in, and we're probably going to be dealing with a 4mm Allen wrench. Yes, indeed. And these bolts are all the same size and length. So I'm just going to rotate the saw up here. I don't know if you'll be able to see all of this detail or not, but I'm just going to move the crankcase by hand till I get the very first one here lined up. And then I'm just going to get it, not fully tighten it, just start it. And do that on all of them. I want a little bit of play here because again, as I mentioned earlier, things may not lined up perfectly. Okay, a chain catcher is going to go there, so I don't really need to worry about that quite yet. So what I am going to do is just try and get that hole for that buffer mount lined up a little bit so that I can fully control the crankcase here using the handle. And then when the time comes, I'm pretty sure there's a different screw that comes with the chain catcher. Let's worry about that after we get these other ones going. So you can probably tell that things aren't going to line up if you don't have all the AV mounts in exactly the same ones in the same spots that you had before. There may be some alignment issues. Okay. I am going to use this tool here to help line the... In fact, it may have been easier for me to line up the two front ones before I did the rear ones. Anyway, do what you need to do. Okay, I think we will find the nut or the bolt for that chain catcher, and we'll just get that installed now. There's no reason why we can't. Be right back at you as soon as I find those parts. All right, we're back. So I did confirm that these are basically should be the same size screws for the chain catcher as is used for the rest of the mounts. You can see there's a shorter one there. This is for the muffler, actually. Anyway, there's your chain catcher. It's plastic. I think if I get the chance, I'm going to find a metal one and use that instead. There's a washer that goes on it. So let's get these where they need to be, and we will then tighten them down. And we'll have a really good solid foundation now to start manipulating this saw. As we rebuild it. 2. 3. 4. 5. And 6. So handle assembly is in place. We have installed all of our new fuel line, the new cap, the bellows, the throttle through the case. We're ready to proceed to the next stage.